Week, an Ipsos survey revealed that 60% of the country believes that we're headed in the wrong direction. This is a decline from the 80% that shared the same view just before the repeat election. At this moment, we want to dissect the numbers and look for patterns in Ipsos' latest survey. And joining us in studio to do so is the man who released the survey, Tom Wolfe, lead researcher, Ipsos. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. I just have to correct, I'm not really the lead researcher.
You're not the lead researcher.
There are many in different departments, but I'm a research analyst.
You're a research analyst. Okay. Thank you for that.
So there aren't any researchers below me.
Okay.
We're all at the same level, but in different areas.
I think our viewers have gotten that loud and clear. First things first, before we even talk about the research and the content that came out of it, what do you think the research would have looked like if you had time to include the handshake, and you made it very clear that that wasn't factored, or that hadn't happened by the time you're getting the data, and of course Miguna's deporting, or how do you think that may have swayed the research? A difficult question, I know, but
yeah, and in fact, I would say you're naughty for asking me such a question, because I'm not a fortune teller
or a prophet.
But that's right. But you've put your finger on a very, very important issue. If I can, I'll come back to your question in a moment to broaden it out, and that is the importance of doing periodic surveys. It is extremely difficult in any country for surveys to keep up with the fast-moving events of reality. Things are happening all the time. True, sometimes they happen in faster and more dramatic fashion than others. But as you, being a media person, and I'm sure your viewers are well aware, the last 1 year in particular, we've seen all kinds of drama and unexpected events taking place almost week by week. And therefore, that makes that the results of any particular survey in some ways obsolete by the time they come in. Now, just to explain again to viewers, for doing a national survey of 2,000, which is what we usually do, the field work of data collection, after the questionnaire has been finalized and pre-tested and so on and so forth, takes anywhere from 7 to 10 days. We had some problems in Northeastern completing the survey because of flooding. Some roads were closed. Our interviewers, we had to substitute some other sampling points, equivalent, we think, in terms of the kind of people who were interviewed eventually, so as not to distort the sample, but that created a little bit of extra delay. Then, even with the smartphones that we use, so that immediately an interview is finished, the data can be sent in with the press of a button, if there's a network locally. We have to receive all of that. We do a number of back checks, both physical on the ground from supervisors to make sure the people who claim to have been interviewed really were, households were visited and so on. That takes place during the field work. We also use our mobile phone studio to pick many of the mobile phone numbers that the respondents give us, to call back to make sure that they answered questions in certain ways. We have silent recordings on the phones to make sure there isn't any cheating in the field by our interviewers and so on. And then, of course, we have to weight the data in case there's a little bit of imbalance in terms of the demographics we know. For example, we know there 51% of Kenyan adults are female. If we get a sample back that shows 53 or 54% of our interviewers were male, we have to weight that back and so on.
Okay.
Then our colleagues in data processing have to produce the Excel tables.
And all this takes how much time? You talk
This
about
would take, well, you could see we finished that survey on the 12th of March.
Yes.
And our release was on 27th. So a good 2 weeks.
And a lot happened.
A lot happened
within those 2 weeks, because this survey took place between the 4th to the 12th of March.
That's correct. Now, just one final point, briefly, and then I'll stop. And that is about the handshake. As we pointed out in the release, the handshake took place midday on the 9th of Friday. We had something like 18% of interviews that were begun and then completed after 2 p.m. on Friday. I think we finished finally on Monday afternoon in some more remote areas. That raises the question, in terms of the distribution of those remaining 18% of the interviews, and in terms of the demographics of who those Kenyans were, and second, in terms of awareness of the event, would it be possible for us, or anybody else who had done such a survey, to make a comparison between those who were interviewed before and after the handshake.
Okay, so those were interviewed 4th to 9th, and then those interviewed 9th to 12th.
That's right, 18%. And I think we showed the margin of error, just in terms of the number who were interviewed after the handshake, around 370, was plus or minus 5.1% for like a 10% spread. That's pretty large, not very good for making minute comparisons, but it might give an impression. The problem was, because we never expected such an event to take place, there was no question embedded in the survey. What's the most dramatic event that's taken place between national leaders in the last week? So we could find out who in fact was aware of the handshake. Nevertheless, we in a way threw caution to the winds a bit, although we explained it and presented it with a lot of caveats, to see, is there anything we can measure once we take those 370 people who were interviewed after and we weight them as if they were an even distribution of Kenya's population in the same way as we would weight those who were interviewed before, especially in terms of what parts of the country, ethnic group, religion, age, and so on. And we found
what did you find
very minor changes. For example, for this question about
and our viewers will bear with us as you peruse
the president's performance. There was a drop of 6% when we compare those in terms of approval before and after the handshake.
Okay.
Now, with a 10% total margin, statistically, there's no change.
You're still fine.
However, we did see a 10% drop among people who identified with Jubilee. So the question arises, was there anything about the handshake in the initial 72 hours that would have given cause for concern among those who identify with the president's party? Because we didn't ask, we did ask why do you approve and so on, but we couldn't see anything in the content responses that would explain that.
Okay.
So the way we left it was, it will really be up to the next survey, even if many more things would have happened with regard to the handshake and many other issues before we can see, did that particular event have any impact?
Fair enough. We'll just have to, when is the next survey?
Bring money and we'll do it tomorrow.
I don't have money right here with me.
No, because we try to do 4 per year.
4 per year.
The next one should be in a month or so.
Okay.
Inshallah.
We'll wait and see. Let's take a look at some of the data from the survey. We're looking at data from 3 different surveys. One that was conducted between 4th to 12th March 2018. Another was done before the repeat election. That's 14th to 22nd October 2017. And the earliest one that we would have here is the one that was done before the first election. That was before August last year, specifically 22nd to 30th July 2017. So let's look at this, Tom, with you. You asked those you polled, in your opinion, are things in Kenya going in the right or wrong direction? Wrong direction, 60%. Right direction, 24%. Neither, 14%. Not sure, 2%. Let's go back in time now to just before the repeat election, and you'll see that wrong direction shoots up from 60% to 80%, which means that just before the repeat election, a greater number of Kenyans were very worried about the direction that Kenya was moving. And in terms of right direction, the numbers were even quite low there as compared to what we saw recently. And let's go back a bit further to the 22nd to 30th July, just before last year's first election. And this time around, about 50% believed we were going the wrong direction, but 38% appeared optimistic that we were moving in the right direction.
A much narrower gap.
Quite a
narrower gap.
Quite a gap there. So my question to you is, in terms of those who perceive the country moving in the wrong direction, the gap still remains almost twice as large. Can you talk to us about this? Just help us walk through and understand before the first election, before the repeat election, and where we were early last month.
Yes, thank you. It's easier to talk about things which are the water that's under the bridge rather than wondering what's going to happen. I mean, the first thing that you will note by looking at this trend analysis is, even if many sections of Kenyan's population, especially in more remote areas, find it more difficult than people in the more central parts of the country to keep track of events through you people in the media, it is remarkable how closely most Kenyans follow national events.
Okay.
The outreach of media is, as well as access to information through public rallies and other statements made by leaders, and then of course with text messages and family members who communicate from more central parts of the country to their relatives at home and so on. So in addition to people's own feelings about things, there is a lot of communication going on all the time. And we can see that with some of these changes. Now, specifically to your point, as you said correctly, just before the election, the survey we finished at the end of July, there was only a 12% gap between those who felt the country was going in the wrong direction, 50, and those in the right direction, 38. Mm-hmm. Now, keep in mind, when we ask the question, why do you feel the country is going in one direction or the other, there are certain fundamental economic reasons that were often given that really have little to do with sort of national politics. Whether people have to go to bed hungry, cost of living and so on, meeting school fees. That's why we always ask the question, and you referred to that earlier, as to what reasons people would give. But I think as a general summary, just to explain that change, the shooting up from 50 to 80%, when, as again you correctly said, our subsequent survey that was completed just before the repeat election, I think there were, and we can see it when we analyze these views or correlate them with political party or coalition identification, it rose substantially across the political spectrum. And again, without getting into a lot of detail with the data, I think on the Jubilee side, Jubilee supporters were by and large unhappy with the nullification. Mm-hmm. They did not think the president and the deputy should have been subjected to a repeat election. Although when we asked a question in that same survey, do you support the independence of the Supreme Court and so on, and should the Supreme Court continue to have the authority to nullify an election, Jubilee supporters were split about half-half. More than 90% of NASA supporters approved of that. So you could see that however unhappy they were about their presidential and deputy president having to go back to the voters, at least half of them were willing to say, we like the idea of having an independent judiciary.
Even if it rules against our candidate.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. Now, where that is at the moment, that's another issue. But so the uncertainty about what was going to happen in the repeat election, and again the fact that Raila Odinga, having announced that he was boycotting it, there was considerable uncertainty whether that repeat election would meet the requirements that the Supreme Court had issued when they gave their ruling nullifying the first one, because you'll remember very well the Chief Justice, David Moraga, said, if you don't adhere to the required regulations and laws, we'll nullify any future election as well. Mm-hmm. He said that. So there was a lot of unhappiness and uncertainty on the Jubilee side. On the NASA side, and again, that's not to say that that election was the only issue feeding into people's perceptions of the right and wrong direction. Yes. There were other issues. We could look at that. But still, the fact that their presidential candidate had withdrawn
was a cause of concern for them.
Was a cause of concern what would happen. There was, I think, also on both sides, fear of some violence around those elections, the repeat election and so on. People on the opposition side, some of their supporters were saying it can't take place in our strongholds and so on. And in fact, in 25 constituencies, the IEBC was unable to hold it. So I think that explains. So then just to come where we are now, a drop of 20% of those who feel the country is going in the wrong direction.
To 60%.
Yeah, from 80 to 60, basically back where it was in early July. And I think a lot of that uncertainty has gone. People may be unhappy with certain things. If you look at the reasons, you can see...
And I actually want to put up one of the reasons that has really stood out. That's the graphic 4 and 5 there on the cost of living.
Yes, back to economic issues. The day in and day out, what we call sort of bread and butter. I mean, the economics of survival, of subsistence. I mean, when there is no immediate political or judicial question to be addressed, you can see. Now remember, and I'm afraid many of our folks in the media don't get this right, we did not read off any list of issues and ask, are you happy about this or unhappy? The question, after people expressed their view about the country's direction, they were allowed only one answer. The question is, what is the main reason you say so?
Okay.
So they could only mention one. So
So
some
those-
of our friends in the media say only 10% of Kenyans think corruption's a problem. Totally wrong. Only 10% think there's a problem with leadership. Totally wrong. It's if you're forced, when you go into a restaurant, your stomach has a finite capacity. You may like everything on the menu.
But you can only eat
but
one.
you can only eat one because
Well,
there's no takeaway.
In my defense, we did this to make it easier for our viewer to
Yes,
understand
that's fine.
what the biggest issue
That's
is. And
fine.
it
I'm
seems
not accusing you,
cost
Mr.
of
White.
living.
No.
And it hasn't changed. If you look at 4th to 12th March 2018 and take us back, I think, to October, November as well. Cost of living then 36%, 37%. Kenyans still concerned by the cost of living, whether it's an election year or not.
And if you go back to our earlier question,
And-
which was not reported in the media, unfortunately, what would you say is the most serious problem facing Kenya today? Because first we asked what's the most serious problem facing people in your locality, and hunger and drought was again at the top, because whereas the rains had started towards the end of the field work, it hadn't had an impact on, mapato kutoka mashamba. But if you look at this chart where we traced it, I mean, high cost of living has been basically unchanged over the last 2.5 years.
Over the last 2.5 years.
It only went down, and again, that was a single mention. It was only after the the attacks in Mpeketoni and Lamu, in Lamu County, where the concern with security skyrocketed. That was very temporary, as you can see. And the other concern with unemployment, and then crime and insecurity in general, those have been relatively constant over the last 3 years. So while it's very useful to find out in the immediate aftermath of a dramatic event, like an election or a handshake or whatever, how that causes a shift in opinion, it's really looking at the trend over time that tells us what the main concerns in this case of Kenyans are.
Okay. I want to let our viewers know that you can weigh in on this discussion. What are your thoughts on some of the data we are discussing and the trends we're looking at? 22422 is our SMS line. Use the hashtag CitizenExtra to talk to us on social media, Twitter, Facebook. I want to jump to the last graphic, if I can. I want to take a look at trend analysis, which you've actually been looking at on your laptop, Tom. When you look at trend analysis from November 2013 to March 2018, a few interesting things stand out. For example, in November 2015, for the first time in that 5-year period, a bigger percentage of Kenyans believed that the country was headed in the right direction.
We call that a plurality.
A plurality.
In social science.
I feel like I'm
a plurality. It
learning
means less than 50%, but the largest number in a group of numbers.
Good. It's on the screen, and that's what you've been looking at.
Yes.
Help us understand what, because this is the only point when that green line crosses over the red one, so to speak. And I was trying to Google and see what was happening around this time. Obama came into the country around this time. What else?
You hit the nail on the head, my friend.
So can I...
There was absolute euphoria with that visit for several reasons. And we've tracked that in another part of the survey, although we haven't released that yet, about attitudes to Kenya's foreign development partners. But we hope we'll release that in the next couple of days.
Okay.
And if you look at the trend analysis there about attitudes, especially towards the U.S. vis-a-vis China, you can see exactly what you're talking about. Now, as to why that actually, what was there about Obama's visit that caused that spike? Did Obama promise that he was going to bring heaven down to earth at the equator in Nyahururu or somewhere?
I don't seem to remember that.
But remember, this was at the end of a extended period of rather, I can say, uncomfortable relations between the government and the U.S. stroke the West over the ICC. And these cases, both of them having been withdrawn, Obama's visit, by its very happening, was interpreted, and I think largely correctly, I have no reason, I mean, I read the international press and so on, as a kind of statement by the United States government that they were putting that ICC issue behind them in terms of the important relations with Kenya going forward. Anti-terrorism, development support, and health, and so on and so forth. So that euphoria was quite short-lived, as you can see,
yes.
because by the time we did a survey just a few months later in November, the country's direction was even worse than it was just prior to the visit.
52% dropped to 37%
so
back
notwithstanding all the hype, if I can use that word, that you and the people gave to, in the media gave to Obama's visit, take a little step back. I know there was one journalist, I won't mention from which media house, who, when we released this result, had like a 10-minute piece on why relations with the U.S. are long-term. We speak the same language. All the Kenyans who study in the U.S., relations with the U.S. will always be better than anywhere else. That evaporated, so that when the next survey or two, attitudes about what foreign country is most important for Kenya's development between the U.S. and China had come back to almost even again. So it's always good to look at the long-term trend. And I just, if I can say one other thing.
Briefly, please.
I got my first training in survey research doing the first Afrobarometer survey in Kenya that was done in 2003. And they do it every 2 years. It's now conducted by the Institute for Development Studies at the university. And they were up to more than 30 African countries comparing data cross-nationally on a variety of economic and governance issues. But due to budgetary and other reasons, they can only do a survey every 2 years.
Every 2 years.
And it's just by sort of finance and that calendar where that survey comes within that particular country's electoral calendar. And that again shows the advantage, if not the necessity, of doing more periodic surveys. And I only wish, with due respect to our competing firms, that they could be doing more surveys as we do, so that Kenyans have even more data to compare.
Okay. If you look at that same graph again, sorry to take you back, and if you can just put it back, I just want to get a brief comment from you on the same. What we saw then in October was now completely different from what we saw back in November 2015, because by that point, those who believe the nation is going the right direction dipped below those who were unsure. So in terms of the psyche of Kenyans in the build-up to the repeat election, it seems that if we were ever at an all-time low as a nation in terms of what we believed, then the high would be in November 2015 and the low would be in October, November 2017.
October, absolutely correct. Because remember, as you said initially, that survey stopped, we finished the interviews 2 or 3 days before the repeat election.
Okay.
So we really caught the uncertainty across the board, and I can say the unhappiness, anxiety at that particular time. I mean, just ask yourself, what would be the difference in this last survey we finished with 82% before the handshake?
Oh, before the handshake?
If we did one last week or now. Even the difference between the period between March the 10th and March the 20th, when there was quite a bit of euphoria about the handshake, and what's happened over the last 2 weeks. I mean, the atmosphere, just look at the evening news or to the daily newspapers. Things are changing almost by the hour. I mean, whether it's in ANC in Ford, Kenya, Wiper Nukambani yesterday,
yes,
the Miguna issue and so on, ODM and NASA, the future and so on. Things are changing so fast. I just wish we had the financial capacity and support to do one at least every week. But we live in an imperfect world.
We live in an imperfect world. Now, I want to let our viewers know that we've been very deliberate in how we've been having this discussion, because most media houses picked one topic from your survey and run with it, 2022. Now, you want to just briefly talk about that and tell us, was it your intention to bring up that topic, or did it come up not deliberately, so to speak? And of course, that's what media picked up, because we want clicks and likes, so to speak, on our pages.
Well, when we release topics, we're happy if the media report them. And we have no power nor desire to control what you people decide to release. And that's one of the reasons that we learned, and since several years ago, when we have a survey and the results are in, we don't give you everything at once. Because as we used to, and then we would just have to go and sort of pray and wonder, what are you going to pick to release and how are you going to, because the other stuff will get lost after the 24-hour news cycle. So we held back at about half of the material from this survey, and I said we'll be releasing that in future. Sometimes we ask a question and we hold it and don't release it until we've asked that question, say, over a year or a half a year to see what the trend is. Now, in this particular case, I think, speaking personally, my main unhappiness was not that the media picked that, but the way it was reported. There was no question in that survey about 2022, nor was there any question about support for any future presidential candidate. The question was, of the following individuals, how likely do you think it is, whether you like that person or not, whether you would vote for them or not, whoever their running mate would be, whatever political, how likely that they will ever become president.
How did you select those individuals?
Well, we looked through the media and tried to pick all the individuals who in the recent past either themselves have said they're going to be in the race, or other people on their behalf have said, don't count them out. I mean, so we picked a finite number of people. You know, you can only interview people for 50 to 60 minutes or they get too much fatigue and so on. You can't. But we did have a follow-up question. Is there anybody else that we haven't asked you about that you think would have a chance of being president? And we got about 50 names. And we're still coding that data.
Okay.
And we can compare that next time.
Are we going to see that data sometime?
So I think...
Of the other names?
If you pay me. I think it's unfortunate that, as I say, the media has a right to pick whatever they thought was important. Although, honestly, again, speaking for myself, these questions about the main problem facing the country at the locality and at Kenya as a whole, nobody reported that. And you would think people would want to mind that, at least if not the very next day or on the evening news, 1 or 2 days later.
But surely you would know that this is what Kenyans would talk about. You've been studying Kenyans for a long time, 2003.
We've had some training sessions for journalists. We would hope they would. Anyway, thrice bitten, 4 times shy, I don't know.
Any regrets? Would you have held this if you knew the response?
No, I don't think so. But I think it is important that we clarify, as you are giving me the opportunity, that we didn't ask who would you vote for in 2022, or even who do you think would win in 2022, because we don't know the combinations, we don't know the running mates and so on. But the fact that, you know, basically when we design our questions, our questionnaire, we have a certain number of questions we ask every time, or almost every time. Country's direction, main problems facing the country and so on. Usually we try to ask, have you been a victim of crime in the last 3 months? We didn't ask that this time because we didn't have enough room, even the Al-Shabaab threat and so on and so forth. But then we have other questions which we try to tailor to the situation at the moment. Such as the Supreme Court nullification or the repeat election, things like that. And because of all of the noise that we've seen, the activity in the media related to the uncertainty about the next election, just look at today's papers. We like to put in questions which have some relevance. Now, whether it would have been wiser for us to hold this one back and then get the other stuff out first, and knowing your tendency to jump on the cake rather than eat your vegetables, maybe that's something we'll have to be a little bit more restrictive.
How do you respond to those who say that this data, in particular this one, was in poor taste? That a nation coming out of an election like the one we had last year, 2 elections actually, that you should have held your horses.
Well, let me not comment. I mean, we believe in a democracy. People have a right to their opinions, and we like people to express them. But, as I said, we would like those opinions to be based on fact. To know, number one, this was the only so-called blatantly, if you want to call it that, political question among all these others, which were largely ignored. And secondly, the actual wording of the question was not reported properly. So we'd like to clarify that, exactly what the question asked and what it didn't ask, and let people, I mean, we're in the business of collecting not only information about people's experiences, whether they've been a victim of crime and their perceptions of challenges in the country. We had so many about, you know, challenges of the Jubilee government moving forward. We believe in the freedom of investigating factual issues and the freedom of expression of opinion. And we're happy to live with whatever, you know, unhappiness people sometimes have.
In your next survey, will you still have something on this?
That's a decision for management. I implement these surveys and present the analysis. Management will decide. But I would be disappointed if some expressions of negativity influence what we do. That's not the way to operate in a free society.